Sometimes life strips away everything you thought defined you, leaving you standing empty-handed in the dust. For 58-year-old widowed cowboy Clay Mercer, that moment came when a flash flood swept away his last good horse, along with his hope of keeping the ranch alive. When a wealthy rancher offered him any horse from his prized stock for free, everyone expected Clay to choose wisely. Instead, he walked past the thoroughbreds and picked Mabel, a stubborn, awkward donkey that made the whole town laugh. But what happens when the one choice everyone mocks becomes the very thing that saves lives? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clay Mercer stood in his kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, the same time he'd been rising for the past 32 years. The simple gold band on his weathered ring finger caught the first light filtering through the gingham curtains that Sarah had sewn the spring before she got sick. He twisted the ring absently, a habit he'd developed in the 2 years since her funeral, and reached for the coffee tin on the counter beside her handwritten recipe box. The wooden box, painted pale yellow with tiny blue flowers along the edges, had been Sarah's pride. Inside lay 3 decades of family recipes written in her careful script on index cards that had grown soft from handling. Clay never opened it anymore, but he couldn't bring himself to move it either. It belonged there beside the coffee, where she'd kept it when she'd wake before him to start breakfast. Humming some half-remembered tune while she worked, the Mercer Ranch stretched across 400 acres of Wyoming grassland, nestled in a valley where the Sweetwater River wound its lazy way toward the distant mountains. Clay's grandfather had homesteaded here in 1923, building the modest 2-story house with his own hands and the help of neighbors who understood that survival depended on community. The place had weathered 3 generations of Mercers, each adding their own touches. Clay's father had built the red barn that still stood strong against the wind, and Clay himself had added the covered porch where he and Sarah used to sit in. The evenings, watching the sunset paint the grassland gold. But now the ranch showed signs of struggle. The fence posts leaned at odd angles, several needing replacement Clay couldn't afford. The barn roof bore patches of mismatched metal where he'd made emergency repairs after last winter's hail. The corral gate hung crooked on hinges that should have been fixed months ago. These weren't the signs of laziness. Clay worked from dawn until well past dark, but of a man trying to hold together a life that required 2 people and twice the money he had. Since Sarah's death, the ranch had become more burden than blessing. The medical bills from her 2-year battle with cancer had eaten through their savings, and then some. Dr. Harrison had done everything possible, sending her to specialists in Denver and trying treatments that insurance covered only partially. Clay had mortgaged the ranch twice. First for the experimental therapy that bought them 6 precious months, then for the hospice care that let her die at home, looking out at the land she loved. Now he owed the bank more than the ranch was worth. In this market, and Mrs. Chen at Sweetwater Valley Bank had begun making the kind of gentle but firm inquiries that preceded foreclosure notices. She'd known Sarah well. They'd served together on the church committee for 15 years, and her sympathy was genuine. But sympathy didn't change numbers on a balance sheet. "Clay, honey, you know I'm rooting for you," she'd said during his last visit 3 weeks ago, sliding the payment extension paperwork across her desk. "But I can only do so much. The bank examiners don't care about history or good intentions. They care about payments, and you're 4 months behind." Clay's nearest neighbor, Bill Hawkins, had been dropping by more frequently lately with offers to help that Clay recognized as polite preparation for goodbye. Bill owned the spread to the west, a successful operation that had grown over the years, while Clay's had shrunk. They'd been friends since grade school, had stood up at each other's weddings, and had shared more than a few beers on difficult days. "You could always come work for me," Bill had suggested just last week, leaning against the porch railing while they watched the sunset. "I need a good hand, and you know cattle better than most men half your age. The pay's decent and there's A little house on the back 40 that needs somebody in it. It was a generous offer from a good friend, but Clay knew it for what it was: charity dressed up as opportunity. The little house Bill mentioned was where he kept his seasonal workers, and they both knew it. Clay appreciated the kindness, but the thought of working someone else's land, living in someone else's house, felt like admitting defeat. The truth was, Clay had been married to this land almost as long as he'd been married to Sarah. They'd met at a church social when he was 26 and she was 24, both of them past the age when most folks in their town had already settled down. Sarah had been teaching at the elementary school then, boarding with the minister's family because her own folks lived clear down in Colorado. Clay still remembered their first conversation, standing awkwardly by the dessert table while she served slices of apple pie with hands that moved like they were conducting a quiet symphony. She'd asked him about the ranch, not with the polite disinterest most town girls showed toward farming, but with genuine curiosity about the work and the land. "I grew up on a farm," she told him, her eyes brightening. "My daddy raised wheat down near Pueblo. I miss the morning sounds, roosters and cattle and the wind through the grain." They'd courted for 8 months, taking long walks through the pastures while Clay pointed out landmarks and Sarah collected wildflowers for pressing. In her books, when he'd finally worked up the courage to propose, standing in the very kitchen where he now made his solitary coffee, she'd said yes before he'd finished asking the question. Their life together had been built on small rituals and shared labor. Sarah had kept the books while teaching part-time, helping Clay navigate the lean years when cattle prices dropped or drought shortened the grass. She'd learned to help with calving season, staying up all night beside a struggling heifer, her gentle hands somehow reassuring to both the animals and to Clay. They'd wanted children, had tried for years, and endured 3 miscarriages that left them both heartbroken but somehow closer. Eventually, they'd accepted that their family would be smaller than planned, and they'd poured their nurturing into the land and each other instead. Sarah had expanded her garden every year, canning vegetables and preserving fruit that kept them fed through hard winters. Clay had built her a greenhouse where she could coax tomatoes and peppers through seasons they had no business growing. The garden was overgrown now, weeds claiming the neat rows where Sarah had grown everything from carrots to cantaloupe. Clay had tried to maintain it the first year after her death, but his efforts had been clumsy and half-hearted. Plants needed the kind of daily attention he struggled to give anything, beyond the essential work of keeping cattle fed and watered. Clay's day began the same way every morning: coffee first, then a walkthrough to check on the small herd of cattle that represented his remaining assets. 32 head of mixed-breed beef cattle, most of them getting long in the tooth like their owner. Not enough to make a real living, but too many to maintain properly with the infrastructure falling apart around him. His horse Rusty had been his constant companion for these morning rounds, a reliable buckskin gelding he'd bought 12 years ago from a retiring cowboy over in Rawlins. Rusty wasn't the prettiest horse in the county, but he was steady and smart, the kind of animal that could work cattle by himself once he understood what needed doing. More than that, Rusty had become Clay's confidant during the lonely years. Since Sarah's death, the one living thing on the ranch that seemed to understand the weight of grief and the struggle to keep going. The coffee finished brewing, and Clay poured it into a dented metal cup that had been Sarah's favorite for outdoor work. She'd claimed it kept coffee hotter longer than the ceramic mugs, and since he'd started spending more time outside and less time lingering over breakfast, he'd taken to using it too. Standing at the kitchen window, Clay could see the place where the corral used to extend another 50 feet toward the creek. He'd sold the panels last spring to pay for feed during a late cold snap that killed the new grass. Each small sale like that felt like giving up a piece of himself, but the alternative was watching his remaining cattle starve. The Sweetwater River curved past his property line, usually running clear and shallow enough for cattle to drink safely, but this spring had brought unusual weather, too much rain in the mountains followed by a sudden warm spell that swelled the creek beyond. its banks twice in 3 weeks. Clay had moved his cattle to higher ground both times, losing precious grazing days but keeping them safe. At least, he'd thought he was keeping them safe. The memory of yesterday's disaster still felt unreal, like something that had happened to someone else. The Weather Service had issued flood warnings, but Clay had experienced dozens of those over the years, and they usually amounted to the creek rising a foot or two for a day before settling back to normal. He'd moved the cattle up to the north pasture as a precaution and secured the equipment he could move, but he hadn't expected the wall of water that came roaring down the valley at 3 in the afternoon, carrying with it half the mountainside, and debris from ranches upstream. In 15 minutes, the Sweetwater had transformed from a peaceful creek into a raging torrent that reshaped his land and destroyed 30 years of careful improvements. Clay shook his head and finished his coffee, pushing away the memories that still felt too raw to examine closely. Today, he needed to assess the full extent of the damage and figure out what, if anything, could be salvaged. The insurance adjuster was coming tomorrow, though Clay suspected the payout wouldn't cover a fraction of what he'd lost. The sun was climbing higher now, promising another hot day in what was shaping up to be a brutal summer. Clay set the empty cup beside Sarah's recipe box and headed for the door, pausing to grab his worn straw hat from the hook beside the kitchen table. The hat had been a gift from Sarah for his 50th birthday, and 8 years of hard use had shaped it to his head and stained it with honest sweat. Outside, the morning air still held a hint of coolness that would burn off within the hour. Clay could hear his cattle lowing in the distance, probably wondering why their breakfast was late. The surviving cattle, anyway. He'd counted only 28 head when he'd gathered them after the flood, meaning 4 were either dead or missing. The walk to the north pasture took him past the wreckage of yesterday's destruction. Where his south fence had stood for 15 years, twisted wire and broken posts marked the flood's path. The small shed where he'd stored salt licks and mineral supplements was simply gone, swept away so completely he couldn't even spot the foundation. But it was the sight of the creek itself that hit him hardest. The Sweetwater had carved a new channel 20 feet wider than before and running 8 feet deeper through what used to be his best grazing land. The gentle banks where cattle had watered for generations were now steep cuts that would make access dangerous. The old oak tree where he and Sarah used to picnic stood alone on what was now an island, its roots exposed and undermining, and somewhere beneath all that churning brown water lay Rusty. Clay had to pause and steady himself against a fence post that the flood had left standing at an odd angle. The guilt hit him fresh every time he thought about it, how he'd made the decision to save himself instead of trying to reach his horse. Rusty had been trapped in the low area near the creek when the wall of water hit, and Clay had been forced to choose between attempting a rescue that would likely have killed them both or scrambling to higher ground alone. He'd chosen to live, and in the brutal arithmetic of survival, it had been the right choice. But right didn't make it feel any less like betrayal. The morning after the flood, Clay found Rusty's bridle hanging from a cottonwood branch 200 yards downstream from where his horse had died. The leather was dark with water and mud, but intact, the same worn bridle Clay had used for their morning rounds for the past 5 years. He stood holding it in his hands, feeling the familiar weight of the brass buckles and the soft spots where Rusty's constant movement had shaped the leather to fit perfectly. Yesterday had started like any other, with Clay saddling Rusty for their routine check of the cattle in the south pasture. The Weather Service had issued flood warnings, but Clay had lived through dozens of spring floods without serious trouble. The Sweetwater typically rose gradually, giving plenty of time to move cattle and secure equipment. He'd grown up watching the seasonal rhythm of high water and had learned to work around it rather than fear it. But this flood was different from the start. The first sign came around noon when Clay noticed the creek running muddy, not the light brown of normal runoff, but the deep coffee color that meant serious erosion upstream. By 1 o'clock, the water had risen 3 feet above normal, and Clay decided to move his cattle to higher ground as a precaution. Rusty seemed to sense something was wrong before Clay did. The horse kept turning his ears upstream, nostrils flaring as if scenting danger on the wind. When Clay tried to guide him toward the creek to gather the cattle that were still grazing near the water, Rusty balked and sidled away, something he'd never done in 12 years of partnership. "Easy, boy," Clay had murmured, patting the horse's neck. "Just a little high water. We've seen worse." But they hadn't seen worse, and Rusty knew it. By 2:30, Clay had managed to move most of his herd to the north pasture, but 4 head remained in the bottom land near the creek, unwilling to leave the rich grass that grew in the floodplain. He'd ridden Rusty down to push them up the hill, working against the horse's obvious reluctance every step of the way. The sound came first, a deep rumbling like thunder, but constant and growing louder. Clay looked upstream and saw what his grandfather had told him about, but he'd never witnessed: a wall of water 6 feet high, carrying everything in its path. Trees, chunks of pavement, pieces of buildings, even what looked like someone's pickup truck, all tumbling in the brown fury that filled the valley from bank to bank. Clay spurred Rusty toward higher ground, abandoning the 4 cattle that stood, bewildered, in the bottom. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the flood reached them. Rusty needed no encouragement now, stretching into a gallop that carried them up the slope, while the roar behind them grew deafening. They almost made it. The edge of the flood caught them 50 feet from safety, the churning water hitting Rusty's hindquarters and spinning them sideways. Clay felt the horse go down, felt himself flying through the air to land hard against a boulder that knocked the wind from his lungs. When he struggled to his feet, gasping and disoriented, Rusty was 30 feet away in water, too deep and fast for any living thing to survive. The horse was fighting, his head above water, eyes wide with terror as he struggled against the current. Clay took 3 steps toward the creek before the futility of it stopped him cold. The water was moving too fast, carrying debris that would crush anything in its path. Jumping in would mean dying alongside his horse. And for what? Even if he could somehow reach Rusty, they'd both be swept downstream to drown or be battered to death against the rocks. So Clay stood there and watched his horse die. Rusty's head went under twice before coming up again, farther downstream now and weaker. The horse looked directly at Clay in those final moments, and Clay imagined he saw accusation in those dark eyes. "Why aren't you helping me?" But horses don't think like that, and Clay knew his guilt was making him see things that weren't there. The third time Rusty's head went under, it didn't come back up. Clay had stood on that hillside for another hour, watching the flood tear apart 30 years of his life. The water topped the creek banks by 8 feet, covering land that had been high and dry since his grandfather's time. The machine shed where he kept his tractor and hay equipment vanished beneath the surge, along with the small barn where he stored feed. Fence posts snapped like toothpicks, and sections of fence rolled downstream like tumbleweeds. When the water finally began to recede near sunset, it left behind a landscape Clay barely recognized. The creek had carved a new channel through his property, deeper and wider than before, leaving steep banks that would make watering cattle dangerous even when the water returned to normal levels. His pastures were covered with debris, tree branches, chunks of concrete, pieces of metal roofing from buildings upstream. The 4 cattle he'd been trying to save were gone, along with their unborn calves. Clay's small herd was now even smaller, and he couldn't afford to lose a single animal. But the livestock was the least of his problems. The flood had destroyed most of his infrastructure, leaving him with land that would require thousands of dollars in repairs before it could support cattle again. That night, Clay had called his insurance company from the kitchen phone, standing beside Sarah's recipe box while he explained the situation to a bored-sounding woman in Denver who asked him to spell his policy number 3 times. She'd promised to send an adjuster within a week, but warned him that flood coverage was limited and that natural disasters fell under specific clauses he should review carefully. Clay had hung up knowing that whatever the insurance paid would be a fraction of what he'd lost. Insurance companies didn't pay for 30 years of incremental improvements, for the knowledge of where to dig a well or how to position a fence to handle the prevailing wind. They paid for replacement value of structures, not for the accumulated wisdom that made a piece of land into a working ranch. The next morning brought the full scope of the disaster into sharp focus. In daylight, Clay could see that the flood had changed not just his property, but the entire valley. The Sweetwater now ran in a channel that was both deeper and farther west than before, cutting off access to nearly half his remaining grazing land. The old ford, where he'd crossed cattle for 20 years, was gone, replaced by a steep banked cut that would require a bridge to span safely. Standing in his ruined pasture at dawn, holding Rusty's muddy bridle, Clay faced the mathematics of his situation with brutal honesty. The ranch had been barely viable before the flood. Now it was impossible. Even if insurance covered the building repairs, he didn't have the money to restore the fencing, rebuild the creek crossings, or replace the equipment buried under tons of flood debris. The bank payments he was already behind on would become completely impossible with his reduced carrying capacity. For the first time since Sarah's death, Clay seriously considered giving up. The thought came with a mixture of relief and shame that surprised him. Relief because the constant struggle would finally be over. Shame because it felt like abandoning not just the land, but Sarah's memory and his grandfather's legacy. 3 generations of Mercers had worked this soil, had built something lasting from raw prairie and stubborn determination. Was he really going to be the one who let it all slip away? Clay walked back toward the house, carrying Rusty's bridle and trying to imagine a different life. Bill Hawkins' offer of work would let him stay in the valley, would give him purpose and a paycheck. The little house on Bill's back 40 was clean and well-maintained, and Clay wouldn't have to worry about bank payments or insurance adjusters or equipment repairs. He could work with cattle without the constant anxiety of ownership, could sleep at night without running endless calculations of debt and income. But he'd be working someone else's cattle on someone else's land, answering to someone else's decisions about when to buy and sell and move the herd. After 30 years of independence, the thought of being an employee felt like putting on clothes that didn't fit. Inside the house, Clay hung Rusty's bridle on the same hook where it had spent every night for 5 years. The leather would dry and stiffen, and eventually he'd need to oil it if he ever got another horse. But right now, he couldn't imagine starting over with a new animal, couldn't picture himself building the kind of partnership that took years to develop. The phone rang. As he was pouring his second cup of coffee, and Clay answered it, expecting another call from the insurance company. Instead, he heard the gruff voice of Tom Caldwell, who owned the largest spread in the county and had never shown much interest in Clay's problems before. "Heard about your trouble," Caldwell said without preamble. "Flood got you pretty good." "I'm guessing pretty good," Clay agreed, wondering where this was leading. "Tell you what," Caldwell continued, "I've got more horses than I need right now, and I hear you lost yours in the flood. Why don't you come by this afternoon and pick yourself out a replacement? No charge. Call it neighbor helping neighbor." Clay was so surprised he nearly dropped the phone. Tom Caldwell was known for his business sense more than his charity, and his version of neighborliness usually involved deals that favored him heavily. But the offer seemed genuine. Even if Clay suspected there might be strings attached he couldn't see yet. "That's mighty generous of you, Tom," Clay said carefully. "But I'm not sure I'm in a position to take on another horse right now. Things are pretty tight." "No strings attached," Caldwell said, as if reading his thoughts. "I've got good stock that needs work, and you need transportation. Seems like a fair trade to me. Come by around 3, and we'll get you mounted again." After Caldwell hung up, Clay sat at his kitchen table staring at Sarah's recipe box and trying to understand what had just happened. Tom Caldwell didn't make generous gestures without good reasons, but Clay couldn't figure out what those reasons might be. Maybe the man genuinely felt sorry for him, or maybe he had some business proposition in mind that would become clear later. Either way, Clay decided he couldn't afford to turn down the offer. Whatever Caldwell's motivations, Clay needed a horse if he was going to continue ranching, even temporarily. And despite his doubts about the future, he wasn't quite ready to give up yet. Sarah had always said that important decisions shouldn't be made in the immediate aftermath of disaster, that a person needed time to think clearly before choosing a new direction. Maybe Tom Caldwell's unexpected offer would buy him that time. Clay arrived at the Caldwell Ranch precisely at 3 o'clock, driving his battered pickup through gates that cost more than most people's cars. The Circle C spread across 12,000 acres of prime Wyoming grassland, with headquarters that looked more like a resort than a working ranch. White-painted fences stretched to the horizon, enclosing pastures where pampered horses grazed on grass that stayed green even in drought years, thanks to an elaborate irrigation system. Tom Caldwell met him at the main barn, a man in his early 60s who wore his wealth like a well-tailored suit. His boots were hand-tooled leather that had never seen a day of real work, and his hat was the kind of expensive felt that serious cowboys saved for special occasions. Caldwell had inherited the ranch from his father and grown it through shrewd business deals and aggressive land acquisition. He was the kind of man who thought of cattle as inventory and horses as assets. "Clay Mercer," Caldwell said, extending a hand with a grip that was firm but soft. "Heard the flood hit you pretty hard. Sorry for your loss." "Appreciate that, Tom, and I appreciate this offer, though I'm still not sure what you're getting out of it." Caldwell's laugh held just a hint of condescension. "Sometimes a man does something just because it's the right thing to do. Come on, let me show you what I've got." The main barn was a cathedral of horseflesh, with 30 stalls housing animals that represented more money than Clay had ever seen. In one place, Caldwell led him down the central aisle, pointing out the various horses with the pride of a museum curator showing off his collection. "That's Thunder Bay," he said, gesturing toward a magnificent black stallion that stood 17 hands high. "Quarter-horse champion bloodline, worth more than most houses. And this mare here is Moonlight Serenade, Arabian stock, sweet as honey and smart as a whip." Clay nodded politely as they continued the tour, but his attention was caught by something at the far end of the barn, while Caldwell extolled the virtues of a paint gelding with perfect conformation. Clay found himself looking toward a small paddock where a lone animal stood apart from the others. It was a donkey, a genet actually, based on the size, standing perhaps 13 hands high, with a coat the color of weathered leather. She was watching their approach with ears pricked forward and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. Unlike the pampered horses in the main barn, this animal had the practical build of a working creature, sturdy and unpretentious. "What about her?" Clay asked, interrupting Caldwell's description of a thoroughbred gelding's racing pedigree. Caldwell followed his gaze and frowned slightly. "Oh, that's just Mabel. She's not really part of the program here. Came with the property I bought last year. Previous owner couldn't take her with him, and I haven't gotten around to finding her a new home yet." Clay walked over to the paddock fence, and Mabel approached without hesitation. She stretched her neck over the rails, not begging for attention, but simply investigating this new human with the same careful assessment she'd been applying to everything else. "How old is she?" Clay asked, reaching out to let Mabel sniff his hand. 8 or 9, I think. She's healthy enough, just not really what we do here. The hands use her occasionally to pack supplies up to the line camps, but mostly she just keeps to herself." Clay studied the donkey's conformation with the eye of someone who'd worked with animals all his life. Mabel had good bone structure, clean legs, and the kind of muscle development that came from years of honest work. Her hooves were well-shaped and properly trimmed, and her coat, while dusty, showed signs of good health underneath. More importantly, there was something in her demeanor that reminded Clay of Rusty, a calm intelligence that suggested she thought before she acted, that she could be trusted to make good decisions when it mattered. "She broke to ride?" Clay asked. Caldwell shrugged. Previous owner said so, but I've never had anyone try. Like I said, she's mainly used for packing. Clay, I brought you here to look at real horses. That thoroughbred there would be perfect for your cattle work. Fast, agile, good stamina. But Clay was already opening the paddock gate. Mabel watched him approach without moving away, standing quietly while he ran his hands down her legs and checked her general condition. She had a few minor scars that spoke of a working life, but nothing that suggested serious injury or unsoundness. When Clay picked up her front hoof to examine it, Mabel shifted her weight cooperatively, balancing on 3 legs without fuss. Her hooves were hard and well-shaped, with the kind of tough horn that came from animals raised on rocky ground. The fact that she stood quietly for the examination told Clay she was accustomed to handling and comfortable with humans. "She's got good feet," Clay observed, setting the hoof down, "and she doesn't seem spooky." "Clay, you can't be serious about a donkey," Caldwell said, a note of disbelief creeping into his voice. "I'm offering you animals worth 10 times what that creature is. Why would you want some stubborn jackass when you could have a real horse?" The question hung in the air while Clay continued his examination. He wasn't entirely sure himself why Mabel appealed to him. Maybe it was because she reminded him of himself, useful but overlooked, practical rather than flashy. Or maybe it was simply that she didn't carry the weight of expectations that came with accepting a valuable gift from Tom Caldwell. A dented metal bucket sat beside the paddock fence, obviously used for Mabel's grain. It was the kind of practical equipment Clay was used to, battered but functional, the sort of thing that did its job without pretense. He picked it up and examined it, noting the way Mabel's ears turned toward him at the familiar sound. "This, a regular bucket?" he asked. "I suppose. The hands just use whatever's handy when they feed her." Clay set the bucket down and made his decision. "I'll take her." Caldwell stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Clay, I know. You've been through a hard time, but this doesn't make sense. That donkey can't work cattle like a proper horse. She's slow, she's stubborn, and she'll make you a laughingstock in the county." "Maybe so," Clay said, "but she's what I want." The truth was more complicated than Clay could easily explain. Looking at Mabel, he saw an animal that had been overlooked and undervalued, relegated to the margins of a ranch that focused on show rather than substance. She reminded him of the kind of honest, unglamorous work that had built his family's ranch, not flashy or impressive, but steady and reliable. More than that, choosing Mabel felt like making a statement about who he was and what he valued. Tom Caldwell was offering him charity disguised as generosity, expecting him to be grateful for expensive horses he couldn't afford to maintain. Taking Mabel instead would send a different message, that Clay Mercer was still his own man, making his own choices based on his own judgment. Caldwell tried one more time to change his mind, walking Clay past the champion bloodlines and expensive breeding stock. "That paint gelding there is bomb-proof with cattle," he argued, "and the sorrel mare has been used for ranch work her whole life. Either one would serve you better than a donkey." But Clay had already seen what he needed to see. When he'd opened Mabel's paddock gate, she hadn't rushed to escape or shied away from his approach. She'd simply waited to see what he wanted, ready to cooperate, but not desperate for approval. It was the attitude of an animal that had learned to be self-sufficient, that didn't need constant management or coddling. "I appreciate all the options, Tom, but my mind's made up. If the offer still stands, I'll take Mabel." Caldwell's expression suggested he thought Clay had lost his mind, but he nodded slowly. "Your choice. I'll have the hands load her up for you. And Clay, when this doesn't work out the way you think it will, the offer for a real horse still stands." As they walked back toward Clay's truck, Caldwell's ranch hands were already leading Mabel toward the trailer. She loaded without fuss, stepping up the ramp with the calm confidence of an animal that had traveled before. The hands exchanged glances that suggested they thought Clay was making a mistake, but they kept their opinions to themselves. "She'll need grain twice a day," one of them told Clay, And she's used to being turned out with the other stock, so she might get lonely by herself. Clay nodded, filing away the information. He was already thinking about how to integrate Mabel into his reduced operation, where to pasture her, and how to begin the process of getting acquainted. But mostly, he was thinking about the expression in her eyes when she'd first looked at him, intelligent, patient, and somehow reassuring. As he drove home with Mabel in the trailer behind him, Clay wondered if he'd just made the worst decision of his life or the best one. Either way, it was his decision, made for his own reasons rather than someone else's expectations. After 2 years of feeling like circumstances were controlling him, that felt like progress. Clay unloaded Mabel in the small pasture behind his house as the sun was setting, painting the grassland in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of better days. The donkey stepped down from the trailer with the same calm confidence she'd shown loading up, taking a moment to survey her new surroundings before walking to the water tank for a long drink. Bill Hawkins appeared at the fence line almost immediately, having spotted the trailer from his own place and come over to investigate. His expression shifted from curiosity to bewilderment as he watched Mabel explore the pasture. "Clay, please tell me that's not what I think it is." "Depends on what you think it is," Clay replied, checking the gate latch to make sure it was secure. "I think it's a donkey where a horse ought to be. Tom Caldwell called me an hour ago, said you'd come by to pick out a replacement for Rusty and chose the most worthless animal on his place." Clay finished adjusting the fence and turned to face his neighbor. Bill's concern was genuine. They'd been friends too long for politeness to hide real worry. "She's not worthless. She's just different. Different." Bill laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Clay, you need an animal that can work cattle, cover ground, handle rough terrain. That donkey's going to make your job 10 times harder than it needs to be." "Maybe, or maybe she'll make it different than I expect." Bill leaned against the fence post, studying his friend with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for sick cattle. "You feeling all right? I mean really all right? Because losing Rusty was hard and sometimes grief makes a man—" "I'm fine, Bill." Clay's voice carried a firmness that stopped the conversation. "It's my choice, and I made it with my eyes open." But as Bill drove away, shaking his head, Clay wondered if his friend might be right. Maybe grief had affected his judgment. Maybe choosing Mabel was just another form of giving up, picking an animal that couldn't possibly succeed, so he'd have an excuse when the whole operation collapsed. The doubts multiplied over the next few days as word of Clay's choice spread through the community. At the feed store, conversations stopped when he walked in, then resumed in whispers after he passed. The clerk, a young man named Danny who'd known Clay for years, couldn't hide his confusion. "Mr. Mercer, did you really choose a donkey over Tom Caldwell's quarter horses?" "I did. But why?" It was a fair question, and Clay found he didn't have a satisfactory answer. How could he explain that something about Mabel had spoken to him in a way the expensive horses hadn't? That her calm self-possession reminded him of qualities he'd once valued in himself, but had lost somewhere along the way. "Sometimes a man's reasons are his own business," Clay said finally, paying for his feed, and leaving Danny to puzzle over the cryptic response. At church on Sunday, the whispers followed him to his usual pew in the back. Clay had been attending services faithfully since Sarah's death, not because his faith had grown stronger, but because sitting in the same pew where they'd worshipped together felt like honoring her memory. Now he heard his name mixed with words like poor judgment and acting strange and maybe we should check on him more often. After the service, several people approached him with the kind of gentle concern usually reserved for someone recovering from serious illness. Mrs. Patterson, who'd taught school with Sarah, was particularly direct. "Clay, honey, we're all worried about you. Making odd decisions after a loss is perfectly normal, but maybe you should reconsider this donkey business before it goes too far." "I appreciate the concern," Clay replied, "but Mabel and I are getting along just fine." That was mostly true. In the 3 days since bringing her home, Clay had discovered that Mabel was indeed different from any horse he'd worked with, but not necessarily in bad ways. She was more deliberate in her movements, taking time to consider obstacles before committing to a course of action. She was also surprisingly communicative, using a vocabulary of ear positions and body language that was more expressive than most horses managed. When Clay had first saddled her, using an old saddle that had belonged to Sarah's horse years ago, Mabel had stood perfectly still while he adjusted the fit. She'd accepted the bridle without fuss and had responded to rein pressure with the kind of immediate understanding that spoke of proper training. Their first ride together had been a cautious affair, with Clay testing her responses to different cues, while Mabel seemed to be evaluating his competence as a rider. They'd covered only a few acres that first day, but by the end of it, Clay felt they'd established a basic working relationship. The breakthrough came on their fourth day together, when Clay was clearing flood debris from the area around Sarah's old garden. He'd been working for an hour, pulling broken branches and chunks of metal roofing from what had once been neat rows of vegetables, when Mabel wandered over from where she'd been grazing. The garden had been Sarah's special project, expanded each year as she discovered new varieties of plants that could thrive in Wyoming's challenging climate. She'd built raised beds for herbs, installed trellises for climbing beans, and created a small greenhouse where she could start tomatoes and peppers from seed. The flood had destroyed most of it, leaving behind a tangle of debris and broken dreams. Clay had avoided the garden since the flood, unable to face the destruction of something so closely associated with his wife's nurturing spirit. But today, he'd forced himself to begin the cleanup, thinking that restoring some semblance of order might help him decide what to do with the property. Among the debris, he found Sarah's garden spade, a hand tool she'd used for transplanting seedlings and working in tight spaces around delicate plants. The wooden handle was scarred but intact, and the metal blade, though tarnished, was still sharp and functional. Clay stood holding it, remembering how Sarah's hands had shaped the smooth places on the handle through years of patient work. Mabel approached slowly, stretching her neck to investigate the tool with the careful attention she applied to everything new. When Clay held it out for her inspection, she sniffed it thoroughly, then looked at him with what seemed like understanding. She used this every day during growing season, Clay found himself saying aloud. Had a whole system worked out. When to plant what, how to rotate crops, which varieties did best in different parts of the garden. Mabel listened with the kind of patient attention that invited confidence. Her presence was somehow comforting in a way Clay hadn't expected, less demanding than a horse but more engaged than he'd thought possible from a donkey. Sarah always said the garden taught her patience, Clay continued, surprised to find himself talking to the animal. Said plants couldn't be rushed, that they grew according to their own timeline, whether you worried about them or not. As if responding to the mention of Sarah's name, Mabel moved closer, positioning herself beside Clay in a way that felt companionable rather than intrusive. They stood together in the ruins of the garden, man and donkey, contemplating the work that lay ahead. That evening, Clay called Bill Hawkins to ask about borrowing some tools for the cleanup work. The conversation was stiff at first, with Bill clearly still disapproving of the donkey decision, but it warmed when Clay described the progress he was making. Maybe I was wrong about her being completely useless, Bill admitted grudgingly, but Clay, working around the property is one thing. Can she actually handle cattle work? I don't know yet, Clay said honestly, but I'm going to find out. The real test would come soon enough. Clay needed to check on his remaining cattle, scattered across the property since the flood. Some of the fencing was still down, and he needed to gather the herd to make sure none had wandered onto neighboring property or gotten into trouble. It was the kind of work that required partnership between horse and rider, the ability to anticipate each other's movements and work as a team. As Clay prepared for bed that night, he could see Mabel through the bedroom window, grazing peacefully in the moonlight. She'd integrated into the ranch routine with remarkable ease, appearing at the fence each morning when Clay came out for chores and following him around the property like a large, patient dog. Maybe Bill was right that she wasn't suited for cattle work. Maybe the whole arrangement was doomed to failure, and Clay would end up looking foolish in front of the entire community. But for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he was moving forward rather than just surviving, making choices based on possibility rather than resignation. Tomorrow he'd find out what Mabel was really capable of. Tonight it was enough that she was there, solid and real, and his own choice in a world that had given him too few choices lately. The letter from Sweetwater Valley Bank arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a postal carrier who wouldn't meet Clay's eyes as he handed over the certified envelope. Clay knew what it contained before he opened it. Mrs. Chen had been as gentle as possible during their last conversation, but bank policy was bank policy. The formal language of foreclosure proceedings couldn't disguise the simple reality. Clay had 30 days to bring his account current or lose the ranch. He read the letter twice while sitting at his kitchen table, Sarah's recipe box, a silent witness to the end of everything they'd built together. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. 4 months of missed payments, plus penalties and fees totaled. More than Clay could earn in a year, even if his reduced herd performed perfectly and cattle prices rose beyond all reasonable expectation. Outside, Mabel was waiting by the gate for their morning routine, her presence a small comfort in an increasingly uncertain world. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd proven herself more capable than Clay had dared hope, showing an intuitive understanding of cattle work that surprised even him. Their first real test had come when Clay needed to gather his scattered herd for a head count. 28 head of cattle roamed across 400 acres of broken fencing, some of them having found their way into draws and gullies where they were nearly impossible to spot from horseback. Clay had approached the task with low expectations, assuming he'd need to make multiple trips and probably ask Bill Hawkins for help with the more difficult animals. Instead, Mabel had demonstrated an uncanny ability to think like a cow. Where Rusty had relied on speed and athleticism to outmaneuver cattle, Mabel used patience and positioning. She seemed to understand that cattle moved better when they didn't feel pressured, that a donkey's steady presence was less threatening than a horse's dynamic energy. When they'd found a stubborn bull hiding in a thicket, Mabel had positioned herself at exactly the right angle to encourage him toward open ground without triggering his defensive instincts. When a nervous heifer had broken away from the group, Mabel had anticipated the move and cut her off with the kind of calculated timing that took most horses years to develop. By the end of that first day, Clay had counted 26 head, still missing 2 from the flood, but better than he'd feared. More importantly, he'd discovered that Mabel's methodical approach to cattle work actually suited his own temperament better than Rusty's more aggressive style had. But that was before the foreclosure notice, before the reality of his situation crystallized into 30 days of countdown. Now, sitting with the bank's ultimatum in his hands, Clay wondered if Mabel's abilities mattered at all. You couldn't work cattle without land to graze them on. After breakfast, Clay walked out to meet Mabel for their daily rounds, carrying his father's compass in his shirt pocket. The brass instrument had belonged to 3 generations of Mercer men, used for surveying property lines and navigating in poor weather. Clay's grandfather had carried it during his original homesteading, and his father had used it to map the gradual expansion of the ranch boundaries. Clay had inherited the compass along with the land, though GPS technology had made it largely obsolete for practical purposes. Still, he'd kept it as a reminder of the men who'd built something lasting from raw prairie, who'd found direction when the way forward wasn't clear. Today he needed that kind of guidance more than ever. Mabel greeted him with a soft nicker, the first sound Clay had ever heard her make. In 2 weeks of working together, she'd been remarkably quiet, expressing herself through body language and movement rather than vocalization. The fact that she'd chosen to speak now somehow felt significant. "Morning, girl," Clay said, checking her over for any signs of injury or illness. Ready for another day of trying to make this work? Their destination today was the North Pasture, where Clay hoped to find better grass for the cattle as the drought continued to brown the closer ranges. The journey would take them across terrain that was still marked by flood damage, requiring careful navigation through areas where the familiar landmarks had been erased or relocated. As they rode through the broken landscape, Clay found himself talking to Mabel more than he'd ever talked to Rusty. Maybe it was her patient ear-turning when he spoke, or the way she seemed to consider his words before responding with some subtle shift in movement. Whatever the reason, her presence invited conversation in a way that felt natural rather than foolish. "My grandfather would have known what to do," Clay said as they picked their way around a new washout. "He came here with nothing but a wagon and a dream, built everything from scratch. But he had time, could work for 30 years knowing the land would still be his at the end." Mabel's ears swiveled back toward him, then forward again as she studied the terrain ahead. Her careful attention to footing meant Clay could relax his own vigilance slightly, trusting her to choose safe paths through the unstable ground. "The thing is," Clay continued, "I'm not sure what I'm fighting for anymore. The land, the cattle, or just the idea that a man should hold on to what his family built no matter how impossible it gets." They crested a small rise and found themselves looking down at the North Pasture, where Clay's remaining cattle grazed on grass that was still green despite the lack of rain. The sight should have been encouraging, but Clay found himself calculating how many head he'd need to sell to make even a partial payment to the bank. The mathematics were unforgiving. Cattle prices were down due to the drought conditions affecting ranchers across the region. Even if Clay sold half his remaining herd, he'd still be thousands short of what the bank demanded, and selling half the cattle would make it impossible to generate enough income to catch up on future payments. As they worked the cattle, moving them to a section of pasture with better grass, Clay noticed how Mabel had developed her own techniques for managing the herd. She'd learned to use her voice selectively, a low rumbling sound that seemed to calm nervous cattle, different from her morning greeting but equally deliberate. She'd also mastered the art of patient pressure, positioning herself where cattle would naturally want to move rather than forcing them against their instincts. It was during this work that Clay made a discovery that changed his perspective on Mabel's value. One of his cows, a heifer he'd been concerned about for several days, was showing signs of illness, standing apart from the herd, moving slowly, not grazing with her usual enthusiasm. Clay had planned to rope her for a closer examination, but Mabel had a different idea. Instead of helping to isolate the sick animal, Mabel positioned herself near the heifer and simply waited. After several minutes, the cow approached the donkey and stood beside her, as if seeking comfort or companionship. This gave Clay the opportunity to examine her without the stress of roping and restraining, revealing a minor infection that could be treated with antibiotics rather than surgery. "How did you know to do that?" Clay asked as they rode home that evening, the sick cow already showing improvement after treatment. Mabel's only answer was the steady rhythm of her hoofbeats on the hard ground. But Clay sensed that her approach to cattle work came from some deeper understanding of animal behavior than he'd previously recognized. Where horses often relied on dominance and speed, Mabel seemed to understand the value of patience and empathy. That night, Clay sat on his porch with his father's compass open in his palm, watching the needle find magnetic north with the same reliability it had shown for 50 years. The instrument worked regardless of weather or circumstances, providing direction when landmarks failed or visibility was poor. Maybe that was what he needed to remember, that finding the right direction didn't require perfect conditions or guaranteed outcomes. His grandfather had navigated by this same compass through uncertainties far greater than Clay now faced, had built something permanent from temporary hardships. The foreclosure notice was still a reality. 30 days, still a countdown to disaster. But for the first time since receiving it, Clay felt like he might have options beyond simple surrender. Mabel had shown him that different approaches could yield unexpected results, that patience and persistence might accomplish what force and speed couldn't. As he closed the compass and prepared for bed, Clay made a decision. He'd spend the next 30 days exploring every possible solution, using whatever time he had to find a way forward that honored both his grandfather's legacy and his own newfound partnership with an unusual donkey who seemed to understand more about life than anyone gave her credit for. The bank wanted him to choose between keeping the land and facing financial ruin. But maybe, with Mabel's help, he could find a third option that nobody had considered yet. The drought arrived like a slow-burning fever, settling over the valley with the kind of relentless heat that made even the hardiest ranchers check the sky for clouds that never came. By mid-July, the grass had turned the color of old leather, and the Sweetwater River ran so low that cattle had to wade through mud to reach the remaining pools of water. Clay discovered the photograph while searching through Sarah's desk for the deed papers his lawyer needed for the foreclosure proceedings. It had been tucked between the pages of an old farm journal, forgotten for years until the legal crisis forced him to excavate every document that might prove relevant to his case. The picture showed Clay, Sarah, and Rusty during happier times, maybe 5 years ago, judging by the gray that was just beginning to show in Clay's hair. They were standing beside the creek in what used to be the south pasture before the flood had carved its new channel and destroyed the landscape they'd known. Sarah was laughing at something, her hand resting on Rusty's neck, while Clay stood beside them with the kind of relaxed confidence that came from knowing his place in the world. Now the creek ran 30 yards from where they'd posed, the gentle banks replaced by steep cuts that made watering dangerous for both cattle and riders. The oak tree visible in the background had been undercut by the new channel and would probably topple in the next big storm. Even the fence posts in the distance were gone, swept away by the same flood that had taken Rusty and changed everything else. Clay studied the photograph while sitting in the kitchen where Sarah had paid bills and planned meals and worried about the same financial pressures that now threatened to destroy everything they'd built. The recipe box sat nearby, its cheerful yellow paint a reminder of the domestic happiness that had once made all the struggle worthwhile. Outside, Mabel was standing in whatever shade she could find, her head hanging low to conserve energy in the heat. The drought was harder on her than it had been on Rusty, whose longer legs and different metabolism had been better suited to the harsh conditions. But Mabel endured without complaint, adapting her behavior to match the environment rather than fighting against it. The partnership between Clay and Mabel had deepened over the past month, developing into something that surprised them both. Where Clay had initially worried about her suitability for ranch work, he'd come to appreciate her different approach to problems. Mabel thought before she acted, considered consequences, and seemed to understand that patience often accomplished more than force. This had become evident during their daily work with the cattle, which now required constant vigilance as the drought stressed both animals and pastures. Traditional methods of moving cattle, the quick cuts and aggressive positioning that worked well with adequate grass and water, proved counterproductive when animals were already weakened by heat and poor feed. Mabel had developed her own techniques for managing stressed cattle, using body language and positioning that calmed rather than excited them. When a nervous cow needed to be separated from the herd for medical treatment, Mabel would approach slowly and stand near the animal until it relaxed, creating opportunities for Clay to work without triggering panic responses. Her intelligence showed in other ways too. She'd learned to anticipate Clay's needs during their daily routines, positioning herself for mounting before he approached with the saddle, moving toward gates before he indicated which direction they were heading. It was the kind of partnership that usually took years to develop, but somehow they'd achieved it in a matter of weeks. The community's attitude toward Clay's choice remained skeptical, though the open mockery had faded into resigned head-shaking. At the weekly Cattlemen's Association meeting, Clay endured pointed questions about his livestock management decisions and suggestions that he might want to reconsider his approach before it was too late. "I'm not saying the donkey isn't a nice pet," said Jake Morrison, who ran a successful operation north of town. "But Clay, you're trying to make a living here. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills." The irony wasn't lost on Clay that Jake's advice came during a discussion of the drought's impact on everyone's bottom line. Every rancher in the valley was facing reduced income due to poor grass conditions and low cattle prices. The difference was that most of them had enough financial cushion to weather a bad year or two. Clay didn't have that luxury. What they couldn't see was how Mabel's different approach to cattle work was actually helping him manage his reduced resources more effectively. Her patient methods reduced stress on both cattle and handler, resulting in better weight gains despite the poor conditions. Her ability to calm nervous animals meant fewer injuries during handling, and her steady temperament made her reliable in situations where a more volatile horse might have created problems. Still, the foreclosure deadline loomed with mathematical certainty. Clay had hired a lawyer primarily on Bill Hawkins' insistence, but the legal consultation had offered more sympathy than solutions. The bank's position was legally sound, and Clay's debt was too substantial for any reasonable payment plan. "Your best option might be negotiating the terms of surrender," the lawyer had advised. "Sometimes banks will allow former owners to stay on as managers or caretakers, especially if the property is difficult to sell in current market conditions." But Clay wasn't ready to consider surrender, partly from stubbornness and partly from a growing sense that his partnership with Mabel represented something worth preserving. They'd developed a working relationship that felt both practical and meaningful, a collaboration that honored the best aspects of traditional ranching while adapting to contemporary realities. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult day when Clay needed to move his cattle to the last remaining pasture with adequate grass. The animals were reluctant to leave the familiar area around the creek, even though the feed there was nearly exhausted. Previous attempts to move them had resulted in scattered cattle and wasted energy for both man and animal. This time, Clay let Mabel set the pace and choose the approach. Instead of trying to drive the cattle quickly to their destination, she positioned herself at the edge of the herd and simply began walking toward the new pasture. Her calm confidence seemed to communicate safety to the nervous animals, and one by one, they began following her lead. Within an hour, the entire herd had relocated without stress or confusion, settling into the new area as if the move had been their own idea. It was the kind of seamless cattle work that Clay had rarely achieved even with Rusty, accomplished through patience and psychology rather than speed and force. That evening, as Clay and Mabel made their way home through the dusty twilight, he found himself thinking about the photograph and what it represented. The happiness captured in that moment had been real, but it had also been fragile, dependent on circumstances that could change without warning. The flood had destroyed the physical setting of that photograph, just as Sarah's death had ended the emotional reality it captured. But maybe loss didn't have to mean the end of everything. His partnership with Mabel was different from what he'd shared with Sarah and Rusty, but it was genuine in its own way. They'd found a working relationship that honored both their individual strengths and their mutual dependence, creating something new from the ruins of what had come before. The drought continued, and the bank's deadline remained unchanged, but Clay felt like he was learning something important about adaptation and survival. Mabel had shown him that different didn't necessarily mean inferior, that success could come through methods that others might overlook or dismiss. As they reached the barn and Clay began the evening routine of feed and water, he tucked the faded photograph into his shirt pocket beside his father's compass. Both were reminders of directions he'd traveled and destinations he'd reached, but neither had to define the path he'd take tomorrow. The future was still uncertain, 30 days still, a countdown to potential disaster. But for the first time since the flood, Clay felt like he was moving towards something rather than just running from loss. Whatever happened with the bank, he and Mabel had built something worth fighting for. The first sign of the fire came with the wind, a hot, dry gust from the northwest that carried the smell of smoke and something more ominous that Clay couldn't immediately identify. He was working in the barn, repairing a section of fence panel that the drought had warped beyond easy repair, when Mabel's behavior changed abruptly from calm to agitated. She'd been dozing in the shade outside the barn door, but suddenly her head came up and her ears pricked forward, rotating like radar dishes, searching for signals. Clay had learned to pay attention to Mabel's instincts over the past 6 weeks, so he set down his tools and stepped outside to see what had caught her attention. The horizon to the northwest showed a brown smudge that hadn't been there an hour. Ego, not the grey-white of normal clouds, but the dirty brown that meant smoke and lots of it. As Clay watched, the smudge grew larger and darker, spreading across the sky like spilled coffee seeping through fabric. His first thought was that someone was conducting a controlled burn, probably the Forest Service clearing deadfall before. Fire season reached its peak, but controlled burns didn't create that kind of smoke volume, and they certainly didn't advance across the landscape at the speed this one was showing. Clay's radio crackled to life from inside the barn, tuned as always to the emergency frequency that connected ranchers throughout the valley. The voice of Sheriff Martinez cut through the static with professional calm that didn't quite hide his underlying urgency. All residents in the northwest quadrant of Sweetwater County, we have a fast-moving brush fire originating near Copper Creek, currently spreading southeast toward inhabited areas. Wind conditions are gusting to 40 miles per hour, and humidity levels are critically low. This is not a drill. Begin evacuation procedures immediately. Clay felt his stomach drop as the implications hit him. Copper Creek was 12 miles northwest of his ranch, which put him directly in the fire's projected path if current wind conditions continued. But more immediately concerning was the location. The Martinez family lived in a small cabin near Copper Creek, where Sheriff Martinez's brother Carlos had been trying to make a go of raising sheep on marginal land. The Martinez cabin sat in a narrow canyon that had only one road leading in and out, a rough track that was barely passable in good weather and would become a death trap if fire reached it before the family could evacuate. Clay had been there twice over the years, once to help Carlos retrieve some escaped sheep, and once to deliver medicine when their youngest child had been sick and the roads were blocked by snow. Sheriff Martinez's voice came over the radio again, and this time Clay heard something different in the tone. Not just professional concern, but personal fear barely held in check. Be advised that we have confirmation of trapped civilians in the Copper Creek area. Emergency services are responding, but access roads are already compromised by fire activity. All available personnel with local knowledge should report to the command post at Sweetwater Church immediately. Clay was reaching for his keys when he remembered that his truck had been making ominous noises for the past week, symptoms of transmission problems he couldn't afford to fix properly. The old pickup might make it to town, but it definitely couldn't handle the rough terrain that would be required for any kind of rescue operation in the canyon country around Copper Creek, which left Mabel. The thought came unbidden and seemed absurd at first consideration. A donkey couldn't cover ground like a horse, couldn't navigate rough terrain with the speed that emergency situations required. But as Clay looked at the growing smoke cloud and calculated distances and travel times, he began to reconsider what was possible versus what was practical. Standard emergency vehicles couldn't reach the Martinez cabin if the access road was already compromised by fire. Four-wheel drive trucks and ATVs would be stopped by terrain that was too rough or steep for wheeled vehicles. Horses could cover that kind of ground, but they'd be spooked by smoke and flames, difficult to control in the chaos and confusion of an emergency evacuation. Mabel, on the other hand, was unflappable. In 6 weeks of working together, Clay had never seen her panic or lose her composure, even in situations that would have sent most horses into flight mode. Her sure-footed approach to difficult terrain was legendary among donkeys, and her steady temperament might be exactly what was needed in a crisis situation. Clay saddled Mabel quickly, his movements sharp with urgency as the smoke cloud continued to expand across the northwestern horizon. He packed his saddlebags with emergency supplies, water, first aid kit, rope, emergency flares, and checked his radio to make sure it was functioning properly. As they set out across the pasture toward the rough country that lay between Clay's ranch and Copper Creek, Mabel seemed to understand that this was different from their usual cattle work. Her pace was steady but determined, her attention focused on the terrain ahead rather than the familiar distractions of home territory. The wind was getting stronger, carrying ash and the smell of burning grass that made Clay's eyes water. Behind them, he could see other ranchers beginning their own evacuation procedures, trucks pulling horse trailers, families loading essential belongings, the organized chaos that meant people were taking the threat seriously. But ahead lay only empty country, the kind of broken landscape that looked peaceful from a distance, but hid dozens of ways for people to get trapped or lost. Clay had grown up exploring these canyons and mesas, had learned their secrets during years of hunting and fishing and helping neighbors with livestock problems. If anyone could navigate to the Martinez cabin under current conditions, it would be someone who knew the country intimately and had transportation suited to the terrain. The first real test of Mabel's crisis management abilities came when they reached Willow Creek, normally a dry wash, but now running with muddy water from flash flooding upstream. The crossing looked treacherous, with unstable banks and fast-moving water that could easily sweep away anyone who fell in. Clay had crossed here dozens of times on Rusty, but always during normal conditions when they could take time to find the safest route. Today, with smoke getting thicker and time running short, he needed Mabel to trust his judgment about where to attempt the crossing. She approached the water carefully, testing the footing with each step while evaluating the current and the stability of the opposite bank. Clay could feel her making calculations, weighing risks against necessities in the patient way that had become familiar over their weeks of partnership. When she finally committed to the crossing, it was with the kind of sure-footed confidence that made the dangerous passage look routine. They reached the far side with water barely reaching Mabel's chest, and Clay realized that her caution had actually chosen a better route than he might have picked himself. As they climbed out of the creek bottom and continued toward Copper Creek, Clay began to see signs of the fire's advance. Ash was falling like gray snow, and the wind carried the sound of flames consuming dry vegetation. More concerning, he could see spot fires starting where wind-blown embers had found receptive fuel, creating a chaotic pattern of advancement that would be difficult for conventional firefighting efforts to contain. It was while navigating around one of these spot fires that Mabel made a discovery that changed everything. She stopped suddenly, her attention focused on something beside the trail that Clay initially couldn't see. When he dismounted to investigate, he found a small stuffed animal, a teddy bear that had obviously been dropped recently, its fur clean, except for the ash that was coating everything in the area. The toy was clearly a child's favorite, worn soft from handling and still carrying the faint scent of baby shampoo beneath the smell of smoke. More importantly, it was lying beside a set of fresh footprints heading away from the main trail toward a side canyon that Clay knew led to a dead end. Clay's radio crackled with an update from the emergency command post. Be advised that the Martinez family vehicle has been located abandoned approximately 2 miles from their residence. Family members are presumed to be on foot in the canyon system. All search personnel exercise extreme caution. Fire activity in that area is increasing rapidly. Looking at the stuffed animal and the footprints, Clay realized what had happened. The Martinez family had tried to evacuate by vehicle, but had been forced to abandon their truck when the road became impassable. Now they were on foot in country that they didn't know well, probably following what looked like trails but were actually cattle paths that led nowhere useful. The side canyon where the footprints led was a particularly dangerous choice. A narrow slot that would become a chimney if fire reached the rim, with no escape routes and very little water. Under normal conditions, it might take search and rescue teams hours to work their way through all the possible hiding places. With a fire advancing rapidly, hours were time they didn't have. But Clay knew that canyon system. He'd explored it. As a teenager, had helped round up lost cattle there, and understood both its dangers and its few advantages. More importantly, he was already closer to the family's probable location than any other rescue personnel, and Mabel's steady temperament might be the key to reaching them before the fire made rescue impossible. Clay picked up the stuffed animal and secured it in his saddlebag, evidence that the family had passed this way and motivation for what was about to become the most important ride of his life. Around them, the smoke was getting thicker and the wind was picking up, carrying with it the sounds of a fire that was growing beyond anyone's ability to control. As he remounted Mabel and turned toward the narrow canyon where the footprints led, Clay realized that everything in his life had been leading to this moment. The years of learning this country, the weeks of building partnership with an unusual animal, the gradual development of skills and instincts that might now mean the difference between life and death for a family he barely knew. The irony wasn't lost on him that the community's laughingstock, the man who'd chosen a donkey over valuable horses, might be the only one positioned to attempt a rescue that conventional wisdom said was impossible. But as Mabel began picking her way down the treacherous slope toward the canyon floor, Clay felt a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with conventional wisdom and everything to do with trust, earned through weeks of patient partnership. Behind them, the fire continued its relentless advance, consuming everything in its path and transforming familiar landscape into something alien and dangerous. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and a family whose survival might depend on decisions made by a middle-aged rancher and a donkey that nobody else had thought worthy of serious consideration. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Clay felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he and Mabel would face it together, partners in the truest sense of the word. Clay pulled the rope from his saddlebag and checked it carefully, running the braided nylon through his hands to verify its condition and strength. It was 60 feet of climbing rope that he and Sarah had used during their weekend adventures in the mountains, back when they'd thought they had all the time in the world to explore the high country together. The rope had saved them both from serious falls during their climbing years, and now it might be the key to saving the Martinez family from something far worse than a mountain accident. The footprints led deeper into the narrow canyon, following a game trail that wound between house-sized boulders and stands of juniper that would burn like torches if the fire reached this elevation. Clay could hear voices echoing off the canyon walls ahead, adults calling for children crying with the kind of exhaustion that came from fear and physical strain beyond their experience. Mabel's ears were locked forward, tracking the sounds with the same focused attention she brought to cattle work. But this was different from their routine partnership on the ranch. The air was getting thick with smoke, and ash was falling steadily now, coating everything with a gray film that made depth perception difficult and breathing uncomfortable. Clay dismounted to study the footprints more carefully, trying to read the story they told about the family's condition and choices. 4 sets of tracks, 2 adults and 2 children, based on the size and stride length. The adults were carrying the smaller child periodically, judging by the places where footprints disappeared for several yards before resuming. That suggested a child young enough to tire quickly, but old enough to walk when necessary. More concerning was the direction they were heading. The canyon forked ahead, with one branch leading toward higher ground and potential safety, the other descending toward a narrow slot that would become a death trap if fire reached the rim. The footprints led toward the slot canyon, probably because it looked easier and more sheltered than the exposed climb toward the ridge. Clay had explored that slot canyon as a teenager, drawn by the same sense of adventure that made dangerous. Places appealing to young people who thought they were immortal. He remembered it as a beautiful but treacherous passage, with smooth rock walls that rose straight up for 100 feet, and very few places where a person could climb out if conditions became dangerous. Under normal circumstances, it was a challenging but manageable hike for experienced outdoors people. But with a wildfire approaching and a family that included small children, it was the kind of place where people went to die. Clay's radio crackled with updates from the emergency command post, painting a picture of a fire that was exceeding all projections for size and speed of advancement. All personnel be advised that wind conditions are gusting to 50 miles per hour with no sign of moderation. The fire has jumped Copper Creek and is now advancing on multiple fronts. Estimated time to canyon rim is less than 2 hours under. Current conditions, 2 hours. Clay looked up at the smoke-darkened sky and tried to calculate whether that was enough time to reach the family, find a way out of the slot canyon, and get everyone to safety before the fire turned their refuge into a furnace. The mathematics were brutal, but not impossible if everything went according to plan. The problem was that nothing had gone according to plan since the moment he'd chosen Mabel over Tom Caldwell's expensive horses. Clay had learned to adapt to circumstances rather than trying to control them, to work with what was available rather than mourning what was missing. Today, what was available was a donkey with an unshakable temperament, and a man who knew this country better than anyone else likely to attempt a rescue. As they continued deeper into the canyon, following the increasingly clear sounds of the stranded family, Clay found himself thinking about the choices that had led to this moment. 6 weeks ago, everyone had assumed he was making a mistake in choosing Mabel. The community had been polite but skeptical, treating his decision as the product of grief-clouded judgment rather than rational evaluation. But grief had actually clarified his judgment, stripping away concerns about appearance and conventional wisdom to focus on what was genuinely useful. Mabel's steady temperament and sure-footed approach to difficult terrain weren't flashy qualities, but they were exactly what was needed in situations where panic could be fatal and speed mattered less than reliability. Sarah would have understood. She'd always valued substance over style, had been drawn to people and things that were authentic rather than impressive. During their years together, she'd encouraged Clay to trust his instincts, even when they led him in directions that others questioned. "You see things other people miss," she'd told him once, after he'd diagnosed a cattle disease that had stumped the veterinarian. "You don't get distracted by what you think should be happening. You pay attention to what is happening." Now navigating through smoke and ash toward voices that were getting clearer but also more desperate, Clay tried to apply that same focused attention to the present crisis. What was happening was that a family was trapped in a place where conventional rescue efforts couldn't reach them in time. What was also happening was that he and Mabel were uniquely positioned to attempt something that everyone else would consider impossible. The voices were close now, echoing from just around the next bend in the canyon. Clay could distinguish individual speakers. A man's voice trying to sound calm while explaining their situation to someone on a cell phone. A woman's voice comforting children who were clearly frightened. And the children themselves asking questions that had no good answers. Clay checked his equipment one more time before rounding the corner and revealing himself to the family. In addition to the climbing rope, he carried water, basic first aid supplies, emergency flares, and his radio. More importantly, he had Mabel. Calm, steady, unflappable Mabel, who seemed to understand that today was different from their routine cattle work. When Clay and Mabel finally came into view of the Martinez family, the relief on their faces was immediately complicated by confusion. They'd obviously been hoping for professional rescue personnel with modern equipment and established protocols. Instead, they were seeing a middle-aged rancher on a donkey, carrying the kind of basic gear that any experienced outdoorsman might have. Carlos Martinez was the first to speak, his voice carrying the strain of someone who'd been maintaining calm through sheer force of will. "Clay, what are you doing here? We called for help hours ago." "I am the help," Clay replied, dismounting and approaching the family slowly. At least for now. Fires moved too fast for vehicles to get through, and the main rescue teams are dealing with evacuations closer to town. Radio says you've got maybe an hour before this whole canyon system becomes unlivable. Maria Martinez was sitting on a boulder with their 5-year-old daughter Elena in her lap, while 8-year-old Miguel stood close enough to his father to grab his hand if needed. All 4 family members showed signs of exhaustion and stress, but they were alert and mobile, which meant the rescue was at least theoretically possible. "We got about a mile past our cabin before the truck overheated," Carlos explained. "Road was blocked anyway. Big tree down from the wind. Figured we could hike out to the county road, but Elena got tired and we took a wrong turn somewhere." Clay nodded, understanding how easy it was to get disoriented in country that looked different when you were seeing it from ground level and under stress. The slot canyon probably seemed like shelter and a clear path forward, rather than the trap it would become if fire reached the rim. "Here's what we're going to do," Clay said, uncoiling the climbing rope and checking the anchor points available on the canyon walls. "This canyon connects to a system of ledges that can get us up to the rim about half a mile from here. It's going to require some technical climbing, but nothing that can't be managed with proper rope work." Maria looked skeptical. "Carlos has some hiking experience, but the children have never done anything like rock climbing. And Elena weighs 40 pounds. How are we supposed to get her up a cliff face?" Clay gestured toward Mabel, who was standing patiently while ash settled on her back like grey snow. "That's where she comes in. Mabel's been packing supplies into rough country for years. She can carry Elena and the gear while the rest of us manage the technical sections." It was a plan that would have sounded absurd under normal circumstances, using a donkey as part of a technical rescue operation in terrain that challenged experienced climbers. But normal circumstances didn't include wildfires advancing at 50 miles per hour with a family trapped in a dead-end canyon. Carlos studied the route Clay was proposing, following the line of ledges and crack systems that led toward the canyon rim. As someone who'd spent time in the outdoors, he could see that it was technically feasible, though it would require careful rope work and absolute trust in their equipment and each other. "How do we know that Donkey won't panic when things get difficult?" he asked. "If she spooks halfway up a cliff face with my daughter on her back, she won't," Clay said with quiet certainty. "Mabel doesn't panic. It's not in her nature." The radio crackled again, with an update that removed any remaining time for debate. "Fire has reached the north rim of the canyon system. All personnel in that area have approximately 30 minutes before conditions become unsurvivable. This is your final warning. Evacuate immediately, or shelter in place and prepare for worst-case scenarios." 30 minutes. Clay looked up at the smoke-filled sky, then at the family, whose survival now depended on decisions made in the next few seconds. Everything he'd learned about leadership during his years of ranching, everything he'd discovered about partnership during his weeks with Mabel, had prepared him for this moment. "We're going now," he said, securing the rope around his waist and beginning the technical preparations that would either save 4 lives or cost 5. "Everyone stay close to Mabel, follow my lead exactly, and trust that she knows what she's doing, even when it doesn't look like it." As they began the most dangerous journey of their lives, Clay felt the same quiet confidence that had sustained him through 30 years of ranching crises. He and Mabel had built something over the past 6 weeks that went beyond simple partnership. They'd learned to trust each other completely, to work as a team when everything depended on getting it right the first time. Above them, the fire continued. its relentless advance, consuming everything in its path and turning familiar landscape into something alien and deadly. But below, in the narrow confines of a slot canyon that conventional wisdom said was a death trap, 5 people and 1 donkey were beginning a climb that would either vindicate a community's laughingstock or provide a tragic confirmation of everyone's original judgment. The first section of the climb went better than Clay had dared hope. Mabel carried Elena with the calm competence of an animal born to mountain work, her sure footing making treacherous ledges look like casual afternoon strolls. The little girl had initially been frightened by the prospect of riding a donkey up a cliff face, but Mabel's steady presence seemed to reassure her in ways that adult explanations couldn't. "She's like a big, gentle horse," Elena whispered to her mother during one of their brief rest stops, patting Mabel's neck with the kind of trust that children offered instinctively to animals that proved themselves worthy. Miguel was handling the technical aspects of the climb with the adaptability that made children natural climbers, following Clay's instructions about hand and foot placement without the adult tendency to overthink every move. Carlos and Maria were more cautious, but they were keeping up and showing the kind of determination that came from protecting their family. The problems began when they reached the halfway point, where the route required crossing a section of loose rock that shifted underfoot with every step. Clay had crossed this area dozens of times as a younger man, but always during good weather when he could take time to test each hand and foothold before committing his weight. Today, with smoke, reducing visibility and ash making everything slippery, the crossing became a calculated risk that had to be managed with split-second timing. Clay went first, setting anchors and testing the route while the family waited on a more stable ledge with Mabel. It was while Clay was halfway across the loose section that the wind shifted, bringing with it a sound that made his blood run cold. The roar of flames consuming vegetation at the canyon rim directly above them. The fire had advanced faster than anyone had predicted, and burning debris was beginning to fall into the canyon like a deadly rain. Clay pulled an emergency flare from his pack and activated it, using the bright red light to signal their position to any aircraft that might be searching for them. The flare's harsh light cut through the smoke-darkened air, but it also illuminated the full scope of their predicament. They were trapped halfway up a cliff face with fire above them, and no way back down. "Clay!" Carlos called from the ledge where the family waited. "We need to move faster. The whole rim is burning." But moving faster wasn't an option when dealing with unstable rock and technical climbing routes. One mistake would send someone tumbling into the canyon bottom, and rushing increased the likelihood of exactly that kind of fatal error. Clay forced himself to maintain the methodical pace that would get everyone to safety, even as burning branches crashed into the canyon around them. Mabel seemed to understand the increased urgency without becoming panicked by it. When a large piece of burning debris landed near the ledge where she stood with Eleanor, she simply shifted position to protect the child while maintaining her footing on the narrow shelf of rock. Her calm response helped keep Elena from panicking, which in turn helped the entire family maintain the kind of focused determination they needed to continue the climb. The next section required Clay to set up a complex pulley system that would allow them to raise the heaviest gear while the family members climbed independently. It was technical work that normally took time and careful preparation, but the fire above them was eliminating the luxury of deliberate planning. Clay's hands moved with the automatic competence that came from years of rope work, setting anchors and threading the pulley system, while part of his mind calculated distances and timing. They needed to cover another 200 vertical feet to reach the escape route that would take them away from the canyon system, and they needed to do it before the fire created convection currents that would make climbing impossible. "Maria, you're next," Clay called, gesturing for her to begin the traverse across the loose rock section. "Take your time with foot placement, but don't hesitate once you start moving." Maria approached the crossing with the kind of careful courage that mothers summoned when their children's safety depended on their success. Clay talked her through each step, providing anchor points and verbal guidance, while she picked her way across terrain that seemed to shift and crumble with every movement. When she reached Clay's position, her face was streaked with sweat and ash, but her eyes held the determination of someone who wasn't going to let fear stop her from protecting her family. "How much farther?" she asked. "Not far," Clay replied, though they both knew that distance wasn't the real issue. Time was. The fire above them was creating its own weather system, generating winds that sent sparks and burning debris swirling through the canyon like a horizontal blizzard. Miguel came across next, his natural agility making the technical moves look easier than they were. But Carlos hesitated at the edge of the loose section, clearly struggling with the kind of exposure that made experienced adults freeze up where children adapted instinctively. "Carlos," Clay called, "you can do this. Look at your hands and feet, not at the drop, one move at a time." But as Carlos finally began the crossing, a gust of superheated wind hit the canyon, carrying with it a shower of sparks that landed directly on the route he was using. The rock face, already treacherous, became actively dangerous, as small fires began burning in the accumulated debris. Clay realized they were running out of time faster than he'd calculated. The fire wasn't just approaching their position, it was beginning to create the kind of extreme conditions that made technical rescue impossible. They needed to reach the top of the canyon system in the next few minutes, or they wouldn't reach it at all. Behind them, Mabel waited with Elena, both of them surrounded by falling ash that was getting thicker by the minute. The donkey's calm presence was keeping the child from panicking, but Clay could see that even Mabel's unshakable composure was being tested by conditions that were beyond anyone's normal experience. The emergency flare continued to burn, its red light a beacon that might help rescue aircraft locate them if they survived long enough to be found. But rescue aircraft couldn't operate in the kind of convection currents that major fires created, which meant their survival depended entirely on their ability to climb out of the canyon under their own power. As Carlos finally reached Clay's position, his face showed the strain of someone who'd pushed beyond his normal limits and found reserves he didn't know he possessed. "What's next?" he asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Clay looked up at the route that remained, another 150 feet of technical climbing through smoke so thick it was becoming difficult to see anchor points more than a few feet away. It was the kind of challenge that would test experienced climbers under ideal conditions, and these were far from ideal conditions. But they'd come too far to quit now, and Mabel was still waiting, below with Elena, trusting Clay to guide them all to safety. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether his choice to attempt this rescue had been inspired leadership or fatal overconfidence. "Next, we finish this," Clay said, beginning the preparations for the final push toward the canyon rim and whatever lay beyond it. The final ascent became a race between human determination and natural forces that recognized no human schedule or need. Clay rigged the rope system that would allow them to bring Mabel and Eleanor up the steepest section of the cliff face, a technical challenge that required perfect coordination between multiple people working in conditions that were deteriorating. By the minute, Maria clutched her rosary as she helped secure the rope around Mabel's chest, the small silver cross catching the red light of the emergency flare that still burned on the ledge below them. Her lips moved in silent prayer while her hands worked with steady competence, managing fear through faith and action in equal measure. "Mabel's done this before," Clay told Elena as he adjusted the little girl's position on the donkey's back. "She carried supplies up trails that were even steeper than this. All you have to do is hold on and trust her to do the rest." Eleanor nodded solemnly, her small arms wrapped around Mabel's neck, while the adults prepared for the most dangerous part of the entire rescue. The rope system would work. Clay had used similar setups for equipment hauling during his years of mountain climbing with Sarah, but it required absolute trust between all the participants and execution that allowed no margin for error. As they began the final lift, Mabel demonstrated the same calm competence that had characterized her performance throughout the rescue. She seemed to understand that her job was to remain balanced and steady while the rope system did the work of vertical movement, cooperating with forces she couldn't control while maintaining the kind of stability that kept Elena safe. Miguel and Carlos worked the pulley system from above, hauling on the rope with smooth, coordinated pulls that lifted Mabel and Elena steadily up the cliff face. Clay managed the technical aspects from below, ensuring that the rope didn't snag on rock projections and that Mabel's path remained clear of obstacles. It was during this final ascent that the fire reached its peak intensity directly above them, creating convection currents that sent smoke and debris swirling through the canyon like a tornado made of ash and sparks. The emergency flare was extinguished by the wind, plunging them into a hellish twilight where visibility dropped to mere feet and breathing became a conscious effort. But Mabel never wavered. Even when burning debris landed on her back, she simply adjusted her position slightly and continued the steady ascent that carried Elena toward safety. Her trust in the rope system and the humans managing it was absolute, the kind of partnership that could only develop between beings who had learned to depend on each other completely. When Mabel's hooves finally touched the solid ground at the canyon rim, Elena slipped down from her back and immediately wrapped her arms around the donkey's legs, tears streaming down her ash-streaked face. "Thank you, Mabel," she whispered. "You saved me." But they weren't safe yet. The canyon rim was exposed to the full force of the wind, and the fire was advancing across the plateau with frightening speed. Clay quickly coiled the rope while the family gathered their remaining gear, everyone understanding that they needed to move immediately toward the evacuation routes that lay beyond the fire zone. Maria's rosary caught the light of the flames as she helped Eleanor climb onto Clay's back for the final trek to safety. The small silver cross had been blessed by her grandmother 50 years ago, carried through every crisis and celebration of her adult life, and now it reflected the orange glow of a fire that had nearly claimed her entire family. "Which way?" Carlos asked, looking across the smoke-filled landscape where familiar landmarks had been obscured or destroyed. Clay oriented himself using his father's compass, the brass instrument still reliable despite the electromagnetic chaos created by the fire. The needle pointed steadily north toward the county road where emergency vehicles would be waiting for survivors of the evacuation. As they began the final trek across the burning plateau, Clay could hear the sound of helicopters approaching. From the south, emergency aircraft that had been unable to attempt rescue in the canyon but could now provide support once they reached safer ground. The rhythmic beating of rotor blades was the most beautiful sound Clay had ever heard, representing the transition from self-reliance to professional rescue support. Mabel walked beside them with the steady pace that had carried them through the entire crisis, her breathing labored from the smoke, but her spirit unbroken. Elena had insisted on walking part of the way herself, staying close to the donkey who had carried her to safety and talking to her in the kind of gentle voice that children used with beloved pets. When they finally reached the county road, emerging from the smoke like ghosts materializing from another world, the emergency personnel who met them could barely believe what they were seeing. A middle-aged rancher, a family of 4 and a donkey, had somehow escaped from a canyon system that everyone had written off as completely inaccessible under current fire conditions. Sheriff Martinez was among the first responders, tears streaming down his face as he embraced his brother's family. "How?" was all he could manage to say, looking at Clay and Mabel with the kind of amazement usually reserved for miracles. "Teamwork," Clay replied simply, his hand resting on Mabel's neck as emergency medical personnel began checking everyone for injuries. "And smoke inhalation," The paramedics found nothing more serious than minor cuts and some respiratory irritation that would clear up with rest and clean air. More importantly, they found a family that was intact and grateful, survivors of an experience that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. As the emergency vehicles prepared to transport everyone to the hospital for more thorough medical evaluation, Elena insisted on saying goodbye to Mabel properly. She buried her face in the donkey's neck, whispering promises to visit and bring carrots and sugar cubes as soon as her parents would allow it. Maria pressed her rosary into Clay's hand. Her eyes filled with the kind of gratitude that transcended words. "For Mabel," she said, "so she knows how much we appreciate what she did for us." Clay accepted the gift, understanding that it represented far more than simple thanks. It was recognition of partnership and heroism from people who had experienced both firsthand. As he clipped the rosary to Mabel's halter, the silver cross caught the last light of the setting sun, a small symbol of faith and hope in a landscape still marked by destruction. The fire would burn for 3 more days before rain finally helped firefighters bring it under control. The Martinez family would recover completely. With stories, they would tell their grandchildren about the day a rancher and his donkey saved their lives. And Clay Mercer would discover that sometimes the choices everyone questions turn out to be exactly the right choices at exactly the right time. But for now, as emergency vehicles carried them away from the devastation and toward the safety of the hospital, Clay simply sat with his hand on Mabel's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing and knowing that they had accomplished something together that neither could have managed alone. 3 weeks after the fire, Clay found himself standing in the Sweetwater Community Center, surrounded by more neighbors than had gathered in one place since Sarah's funeral. The difference was that this time people were celebrating rather than mourning, honoring life preserved rather than life lost. The hand-carved plaque that Carlos Martinez presented to Clay and Mabel was made from oak that had been salvaged from the fire zone, its surface polished smooth and inscribed with words that would outlast everyone present. To Clay Mercer and Mabel, heroes who proved that courage comes in unexpected forms, and salvation often arrives on 4 steady hooves. Elena Martinez, fully recovered from her ordeal, insisted on reading the inscription aloud to the assembled crowd, her voice clear and strong as she pronounced each word with the careful emphasis of someone who understood their importance. When she finished, she wrapped her arms around Mabel's neck and whispered something that made the donkey's ears prick forward with interest. "She's asking if Mabel remembers carrying her up the mountain," Elena's mother Maria translated, smiling at the bond that had developed between her daughter and the animal who had literally carried her to safety. "Elena wants to know if they can be best friends forever." The crowd's laughter was warm and genuine, the kind of community response that Clay hadn't experienced since before Sarah's illness had isolated him from social gatherings. But this wasn't pity or obligation, it was respect earned through actions. That had impressed even the skeptics who had questioned his judgment just a month ago. Tom Caldwell was among those present, his expression thoughtful as he studied the partnership between Clay and Mabel with new appreciation. "Clay, I owe you an apology," he said during the reception that followed the ceremony. "I thought you were making a mistake when you chose that. Donkey over my best horses. Turns out you saw something the rest of us missed." "Maybe I just saw what I needed," Clay replied, accepting the handshake that felt like closure on months of community doubt. "Mabel and I suit each other. Sometimes. That matters more than pedigree or performance records." The financial crisis that had threatened to destroy Clay's ranch had been resolved through an unexpected combination of community support and bureaucratic flexibility. The bank had agreed to restructure his loan after local businessmen had privately approached them about the negative publicity that would come from foreclosing on a local hero. More practically, several neighbors had contracted with Clay for cattle management services that would provide steady income while he rebuilt his storm-damaged infrastructure. Bill Hawkins had been the first to approach Clay with a business proposition. His earlier skepticism transformed into grudging admiration for what his friend had accomplished. "I've got more cattle than I can manage properly," he'd said. "Been thinking about hiring help anyway, and after what you and that donkey did in the fire, I figure you know something about handling difficult situations." The work was different from owning his own herd, but it allowed Clay to stay on his land while generating income that would eventually let him rebuild his own operation. More importantly, it was work that utilized the unique partnership he'd developed with Mabel, whose patient approach to cattle management had proven valuable in ways that no one had anticipated. Mrs. Chen from the bank had attended the ceremony. Her presence, a visible symbol of the institution's changed attitude toward Clay's financial situation. "Community banks exist to serve the community," she'd told the local newspaper. "When someone demonstrates the kind of character and resourcefulness that Mr. Mercer showed during the fire, we have an obligation to find ways to support their continued success." The insurance settlement for the flood damage had also been more generous than Clay had expected, aided by the positive publicity surrounding the rescue and by community pressure on the insurance company to treat local heroes fairly. The money wouldn't restore everything he'd lost, but it would fund the essential repairs that would make the ranch viable again. As the ceremony concluded and neighbors began drifting toward their vehicles, Clay found himself reflecting on the changes that 6 months had brought to his life. The morning he'd chosen Mabel over Tom Caldwell's expensive horses had seemed like the action of a man who'd given up on conventional success. Now it looked like the beginning of a different kind of success, one that valued partnership and problem-solving over status and appearance. Elena Martinez lingered near Mabel, reluctant to end what had become a weekly tradition of visiting the donkey who had saved her life. She'd brought carrots and sugar cubes as promised, offerings that Mabel accepted with the patient grace that had characterized her performance throughout their shared ordeal. "Daddy says Mabel is the bravest animal in the whole county," Elena told Clay seriously. "Is that true?" Clay considered the question while watching Mabel interact with the child whose life she'd helped preserve. Courage had many definitions, and the flashy heroics that people usually celebrated were only one form of bravery. Mabel's courage was quieter but no less real. The willingness to face uncertainty without panic, to trust partnerships that had been built through daily work rather than dramatic gestures. "I think Mabel is brave in her own way," Clay said finally. "She doesn't get scared easily, and she doesn't give up when things get difficult. Those might be the most important kinds of courage." As the Martinez family prepared to leave, Carlos approached Clay with an expression that conveyed gratitude beyond anything words could express. "My family owes you a debt we can never repay," he said. "But if you ever need anything at all, you call us first." It was the kind of offer that came from people who had experienced genuine life-or-death assistance, who understood the difference between casual favors and essential support. Clay accepted it with the humility of someone who had discovered that heroism was often a community effort rather than an individual achievement. After everyone had left, Clay and Mabel made their way home through the autumn evening, passing landmarks that had been shaped by flood and fire but were slowly returning to familiar patterns. The ranch still showed signs of the disasters that had nearly destroyed it, but it also showed signs of recovery and adaptation that suggested a viable future. Standing in his kitchen beside Sarah's recipe box, Clay realized that the simple gold band on his finger no longer felt like a weight from the past, but like a connection to values that remained constant despite changing circumstances. Sarah would have approved of his partnership with Mabel, would have understood that strength came in many forms and that the most reliable partnerships were often the least obvious ones. Outside, Mabel was grazing peacefully in the pasture, her contentment visible in the relaxed set of her ears and the steady rhythm of her movement. She'd returned to the routines of ranch life, as if the dramatic rescue had been just another day's work. But Clay knew that their bond had been transformed by the experience of depending on each other when everything was at stake. Tomorrow would bring the usual challenges of cattle management and ranch maintenance, the ongoing work of building something sustainable from damaged foundations. But tonight, Clay felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had discovered that his judgment was sound, his partnerships were genuine, and his place in the community was secure. Sometimes the choices that everyone questions turn out to be exactly right. Sometimes the most unlikely partnerships prove to be the strongest. And sometimes a middle-aged rancher and a patient donkey can accomplish together what neither could manage alone, creating something worthy of respect and gratitude that would outlast them both.